I moved into the neighborhood believing it would be the kind of place where people greeted each other from their porches, walked dogs in the cool mornings, and waved politely at passing cars. The welcome brochure had promised a harmonious community dedicated to maintaining pristine standards, but the reality turned out to be something far different. And the very first sign of trouble came not from some loud party or untrimmed lawn, but from a small, folded piece of paper tucked under my doormat. It was an official notice from the HOA, and at the bottom, in glossy red ink, were the words "Compliant action required immediately." The letter claimed that my dog Milo, a calm, elderly golden retriever who spent half his day sleeping and the other half slow walking with me, was a nuisance animal. The list of alleged violations was almost comical: excessive barking at all hours, aggressive posturing toward neighbors, unauthorized roaming, and even a vague note about potential safety concerns. I laughed at first. Milo barely had the energy to posture at his own reflection. The barking accusation alone was absurd. The dog rarely made a sound unless he dreamed of chasing imaginary squirrels. My amusement faded quickly when I noticed the stern language and the threat of escalating fines. The HOA demanded an immediate response and proof that I had taken corrective measures, whatever that was supposed to mean. It felt like a prank, but the letterhead, the formatting, and the official signatures made it clear. Someone had filed a formal complaint, and the board had accepted it without question. I tried to brush it off with logic. Obviously, someone had made a mistake. Maybe another dog in the neighborhood caused trouble, and the complaints were misdirected. All it would take was a simple clarification. But when I reached out to the HOA office, the response was shockingly cold. They insisted the complaints had been verified, though they refused to specify how, by whom, or with what evidence. The dismissal was immediate and absolute. The board members, it seemed, had already decided Milo was guilty. I began to notice the subtle signs of surveillance. A neighbor across the street, whom I'd spoken to only once, started lingering in her front window whenever I took Milo out. Another neighbor pretended to water his lawn while keeping a suspicious eye on us. Cars occasionally slowed as they passed, their drivers taking quick glances in my direction. The entire situation felt orchestrated, like a petty power play that I somehow stumbled into without realizing it. Days later, a second notice appeared, this one even more aggressive. It stated that Milo's ongoing disturbances continued despite the first warning. The fines began accumulating on paper, along with a threat of forced removal if I did not comply. The message was unmistakably hostile. The HOA wasn't simply notifying me. They were building a case. The situation escalated further when I found a printed flyer taped to my mailbox. It was a neighborhood alert warning residents to be cautious around my dog. The flyer featured an unflattering, poorly lit photo of Milo taken from across the street. The accompanying text described him as unpredictable and implied he had already confronted several residents aggressively. The accusation was both ridiculous and infuriating. Milo hadn't confronted anyone. He barely noticed people unless they offered treats. I confronted a few neighbors politely, hoping someone would at least admit they hadn't seen any bad behavior. The responses varied from awkward avoidance to passive shrugs. Most refused to get involved, but one neighbor, a quiet woman who walked her own small terrier early each morning, whispered to me that the HOA president Linda Caldwell had been spreading rumors. According to her, Linda had been telling people that Milo had frightened a child and lunged at an elderly man. There had been no such incidents, of course, yet the stories were spreading like wildfire. Linda Caldwell, I soon learned, was notorious for her tight control over the neighborhood. She saw herself as the guardian of community perfection, enforcing rules with ferocity and inventing new ones whenever it suited her. Her word was rarely questioned, and she wielded the HOA rulebook like a personal weapon. If she decided a house had the wrong shade of shutters, the homeowner wasn't safe until the paint dried. And now, apparently, she had decided Milo was a threat to her pristine vision. I realized I was no longer facing a simple misunderstanding. This was a targeted attack. That's when I called my cousin. Daniel wasn't the typical lawyer found on billboards or television ads. He specialized in property law and HOA disputes, and he had a particular fondness for dismantling the arrogance of overreaching boards. Whenever he visited family gatherings, he entertained us with outrageous stories of HOA corruption, petty tyrants, and dramatic courtroom victories. He always ended his tales with the same line: "The rulebook only works if people don't read it." When I explained the situation to him over the phone, he paused only a moment before letting out a low, amused hum. I could practically hear the crackle of excitement through the line. He asked me to forward every notice, flyer, and scrap of communication I had received. Then he asked for one more thing: a detailed account of Milo's daily routine. I told him everything: how Milo spent most of the day sleeping beside the window, how our walks were leisurely strolls, how the dog had never barked at a neighbor. Daniel listened carefully, taking notes as though we were preparing for a trial, and in a way, we were. By the time I finished, he sounded almost disappointed that this was the best the HOA could come up with. Over the next few days, Daniel dug into the HOA's governing documents, cross-referencing policies with state regulations. He asked me to take note of any suspicious activity, especially anyone attempting to provoke Milo or manufacture evidence. And sure enough, strange events continued. A board member lingered near my fence one morning, pretending to tie his shoe while holding up a phone as if recording something. Another neighbor walked by with a small recorder in hand, muttering loudly about dangerous animals. Even more absurd were the mysterious barks echoing late at night recordings, clearly, of some other dog played through a portable speaker near my house. A few neighbors even reported seeing someone crouching behind bushes with a camera. It was as though the entire board had decided to create evidence out of thin air. As the pressure mounted, I documented everything, just as Daniel instructed. I filmed the suspicious visits, saved every notice, and compiled dates and times meticulously. It felt like building a case for a documentary, piecing together the story of a neighborhood consumed by pettiness. When Daniel finally said he was ready, he asked only one question: whether I trusted him to handle it. I didn't hesitate. He told me he'd be arriving soon, and that once he did, the HOA wouldn't know what hit them. And so, as the warnings intensified and the whispers around the neighborhood grew louder, I waited for the moment my cousin would step in. Because if the HOA wanted a battle, they had unknowingly chosen the worst possible opponent. The storm was coming in. The first winds were just beginning to rise. Daniel arrived on a quiet afternoon, his car rolling to a stop in my driveway with the calm confidence of someone who had already read the ending of this story and found it amusing. He stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase filled with printed statutes, highlighted HOA bylaws, and a laptop adorned with stickers from various legal conferences. His presence alone felt like a shift in the atmosphere, like the first rumble of thunder announcing an oncoming storm. He examined Milo the moment he walked inside. Milo lifted his head lazily, blinked twice, and wagged his tail with minimal enthusiasm before going back to sleep. Daniel knelt beside him, gently lifting a floppy ear, checking his paws, and observing the old dog's mannerisms. When he finished, he shook his head and smiled with disbelief. As though the accusations against Milo were a personal insult to his intelligence, without wasting time, Daniel spread papers across my dining table. He arranged them in a meticulous order timeline of complaints, HOA notices, neighborhood flyers, my documented videos, and finally, the governing documents he had printed. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the table as he read through each page, occasionally pausing to jot down notes or mark a section for later. For 2 hours he studied everything. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the scratching of his pen and Milo's soft snoring. When he finally leaned back in his chair, the verdict was clear from the look on his face. The HOA had overplayed its hand. He explained his first conclusion. The HOA had no authority to enforce any of the accusations. They'd made not one. Their own bylaws invalidated the majority of the claims, and the rest were contradicted by state law. Even more damning were the procedural violations. Several of the notices they sent lacked required signatures. Others failed to provide evidence or a proper appeal process. It was a sloppy attempt at intimidation, but the most significant revelation was this: Linda Caldwell had been issuing directives without board approval. Some of the documents bore signatures she had no right to use. Others were distributed without any formal vote. Individually, these might have been chalked up to administrative errors. Combined, however, they painted a picture of someone who believed herself to be above the rules she claimed to protect. Daniel's strategy was simple but devastating. We would not confront the HOA directly, not yet. Instead, we would gather more evidence, enough to undermine every false claim, expose their misconduct, and make their actions indefensible. Once the case was airtight, he would set the stage for a confrontation they could not escape, and so the surveillance began not from the HOA toward me, but from our side toward them. We installed additional cameras around the property, discreetly angled to capture the street, the yard, and the walkway leading to my home. Within days, the cameras recorded several suspicious events. At dusk one evening, a board member, someone I barely recognized, walked slowly past my fence with a recording device pressed against her ear. She made exaggerated gasping sounds, muttering words like, "There he goes," and aggressive, "Milo." On the other side of the yard lay asleep on his dog bed. On another occasion, a man from 2 houses down stood near my mailbox, holding what looked like a small speaker. Moments later, the sound of frenzied barking echoed through the airbarks that matched no dog in our neighborhood. It was clearly a recording. When I stepped outside, he sprinted away. Daniel watched these recordings with a combination of amusement and irritation. He cataloged each one into a labeled folder, creating timestamps and summaries. He treated every piece of footage as though it were evidence in a high-profile trial. Yet the HOA continued pushing. A third notice arrived, this one claiming multiple neighbors had confirmed Milo's dangerous behavior. Another threatened weekly fines, and a particularly dramatic letter warned that failure to remove the animal could result in mandatory enforcement measures, though it provided no explanation for what those measures were supposed to be. Daniel encouraged me to remain calm. His confidence was contagious. He seemed to relish every new misstep the HOA made. According to him, each incorrect claim, each vaguely worded threat, and each improperly formatted notice strengthened our case. But beneath the legal thrill, something darker lurked. The HOA was clearly escalating. Their actions were growing bolder, more desperate, as though they expected resistance and were determined to crush it before it became a threat. They targeted me with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The turning point came one night when a neighbor, someone entirely uninvolved, approached my door, visibly shaken. She held a letter she had received in her mailbox earlier that day. The notice warned her that my dog had attempted to attack several residents, and urged her to remain vigilant when walking past my home. It also encouraged her to contact the HOA immediately if she witnessed any concerning behavior. The neighbor explained that she had lived beside me for months and had never once heard Milo bark. She suspected the HOA was using other residents as pawns in whatever internal drama they were stirring. Her willingness to come forward gave me hope, and it gave Daniel something else, a witness. After she left, Daniel added her letter to the growing stack of questionable documents. He circled key phrases, highlighting areas where Linda had overstepped her authority. The pile of evidence was becoming substantial. The next morning, a new tactic emerged. 2 board members walked slowly past my house with clipboards, pretending to conduct a routine inspection. They paused often, writing notes as they glanced toward the yard, toward Milo, and toward my front window where they no doubt suspected I was watching. Their charade might have fooled someone unfamiliar with HOA procedures, but for Daniel, it was just another gift. Routine inspections required advance notice, and these 2 had given none. Over the following week, Daniel drafted a formal report, a comprehensive account of every violation committed not by me, but by the HOA itself. He organized the evidence in chronological order, citing sections of their bylaws they had ignored or violated. He cross-referenced everything with state law. It was a meticulous, devastating compilation. But before he sent anything, he insisted on one more step, building a complete timeline of Milo's daily routine. He asked me to keep detailed logs, times of walks, feeding schedules, behavior notes. He wanted to demonstrate beyond doubt that Milo could not have committed any of the alleged incidents. It felt tedious at first, but I understood the importance. And as the entries added up, I realized how ridiculous the HOA's claims truly were. According to them, Milo had caused chaos at times when he was either at the vet, at home sleeping, or walking peacefully on a leash beside me. The contradictions were almost laughable. Finally, after weeks of surveillance, documentation, and preparation, Daniel looked over the assembled evidence with a satisfied nod. He closed his laptop gently, as though sealing the fate of those who had underestimated him. He announced that it was time. Time for the HOA to face the consequences of their lies. Time for Linda Caldwell to answer for the power she had abused. Time for the neighborhood to learn just how badly the board had miscalculated, and time for Milo Sweet, Sleepy, Harmless My Load to be cleared once and for all. The stage was set, and the confrontation was inevitable. The morning Daniel decided to strike back began quietly, with a strange, almost eerie calmness hanging over the neighborhood. The street was empty, the houses still, the usual routine of dog walkers and joggers noticeably absent. Even the air felt different, as if the neighborhood itself sensed that something significant was about to shift. Daniel began by assembling a packatan, immaculately organized, meticulously documented dossier that contained every piece of evidence we had collected. Videos, screenshots, printed emails, timestamps, photographs, neighbor statements, bylaws, state regulations, all bound together in a thick, daunting stack. He labeled it with a simple title, Formal Grievance and Request for Immediate Hearing. His tone was relaxed, almost casual, as he explained the next steps. He planned to send the packet not only to the HOA board, but also to the property management company overseeing them, the state's housing regulatory office, and perhaps most threatening of all, the legal counsel listed in the HOA's governing documents. The board might have been used to intimidating residents with empty threats, but now they were about to face something far more formidable, someone who understood the system better than they did. Before sending anything, however, he insisted we walk the neighborhood, not to provoke confrontation, but to observe. And what we observed confirmed his suspicions. Ordinarily, people would nod politely or wave as we passed, but today, curtains twitched, doors shut quickly, and residents pretended to be too busy to make eye contact. The rumors had spread far beyond what I had realized. Some looked fearful, as though Milo and I were at the center of some dangerous spectacle. Others looked guilty, perhaps recognizing the lies they had silently allowed to grow as we turned onto the next street. Daniel nudged me subtly. Across the road, Linda Caldwell stood in her driveway, arms folded, chin lifted. She stared at us with an expression of triumphant smugness, like someone who believed she had already won. If she noticed Daniel, she gave no sign. To her, I was simply another resident she had successfully cornered. But Daniel studied her closely, quietly analyzing her posture, her expression, the way she held herself. To him, she wasn't a tyrant, she was a liability, a predictable force who had made predictable mistakes. When we returned home, Daniel sent the packet electronically to every required party. Then he printed physical copies and hand-delivered them to the HOA's Dropbox, slipping them through the slot with calm precision. With that final gesture, the wheels were in motion. The HOA had been notified, their actions were documented, and, legally, they were required to respond. The next 48 hours were tense but revealing. The first sign that the board had received the dossier came in the form of sudden, frantic activity outside Linda's house. Cars parked and reparked repeatedly. Board members came and went with stacks of papers clutched against their chests. Some looked panicked. Others looked angry. One man paced in circles near the mailbox, muttering under his breath as if trying to rehearse excuses. Daniel observed all of this from my window, his expression unreadable. Later that afternoon, a mass email arrived from the HOA. It was a poorly constructed message filled with vague language about recent concerns, ongoing investigations, and miscommunications. It urged residents to remain patient. While the board reviewed certain procedural matters, the tone was unmistakably defensive. Daniel chuckled at the wording. To him, it read like an admission. But the board wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. The next day, an envelope appeared in my mailbox, a notice of an emergency HOA meeting. The meeting was mandatory for all board members, optional for residents, and scheduled for the following evening in the community clubhouse. The notice claimed the meeting would address recent allegations and community safety regarding household pets. Daniel interpreted this as a final attempt by the board to save face. They were gathering to reassert their authority, unaware that they had already lost control of the narrative. He decided we would attend not to confront them, but to observe their defense, and if they chose to attack, he would be ready. When the meeting day arrived, the clubhouse parking lot quickly filled. Residents emerged from their cars in small groups, whispering to one another with uncertain glances. The once unified faith in the HOA had begun to crack, and fear mingled with curiosity in the air. Inside, folding chairs faced a long table where the board sat. Linda occupied the center seat, posture stiff, smile brittle. The other board members looked far less confident, shifting nervously as papers rustled in their unsteady hands. Daniel and I slipped quietly into seats near the back. Milo, per the meeting rules, stayed at home sleeping, most likely without any awareness of the chaos surrounding his existence. The meeting opened with Linda clearing her throat dramatically and launching into a statement about community unity. She danced carefully around specifics, trying to portray herself as a calm, reasonable leader, but her voice wavered each time she referenced safety concerns, betraying the nerves beneath her practiced demeanor. Midway through her speech, a resident raised a tentative hand. She asked why so many neighbors received alarming letters about Milo when none of them had personally witnessed any dangerous behavior. Linda faltered, glancing at the board members as if seeking backup. None came. The room grew tense. Another resident spoke, this time more boldly. He questioned the legality of the warnings and whether the board had followed proper procedures. Others murmured in agreement. The support Linda had come to rely on was cracking. Daniel sat still, watching the room unravel. He didn't need to intervene, yet the residents were doing it themselves. Rumors were collapsing under scrutiny. The fabricated narrative was breaking apart, and Linda's polished mask was losing its shine. Finally, a man stood and held up the letter we had received about Milo. He demanded to know what verified incidents the board had supposedly documented. When Linda hesitated, the man pressed further. He asked if the board had any actual evidence. Linda's answer was vague, too vague, and the room knew it. Whispers of disapproval swept through the crowd. A board member leaned toward Linda, whispering urgently into her ear. She shook her head, trying to maintain her composure. But it was clear the board was cornered, and they had no plan for escape. That's when Daniel finally stood. The room quieted. Instantly, he introduced himself with calm authority, stating that he was present as my representative. The board members stiffened. Linda's eyes narrowed with recognition. This was not some uninformed homeowner she could intimidate. Daniel announced that the board's actions violated multiple sections of their own governing documents and several state regulations. He stated fact after fact, each supported by references, dates, and documented evidence. He spoke clearly, confidently, without hostility, every word chosen precisely. And when he revealed the recordings of the staged barking, the surveillance attempts, and the fabricated accusations, the room erupted in shock. Some residents gasped. Others muttered angrily. A few stood abruptly, demanding answers from the board. Linda tried to respond, but her voice trembled. She attempted to deny knowledge of certain actions, but Daniel calmly countered with timestamps and signatures. She attempted to shift blame onto miscommunication, but Daniel pointed out procedural violations that required her direct involvement. Piece by piece, he dismantled the board's authority by the time he finished. The room had turned fully against the HOA leadership. Linda's face was pale. Several board members appeared defeated, staring blankly at the papers before them. The meeting concluded without resolution, but the message was clear. The board was in trouble, and Linda was at the center of the storm. As residents filed out, whispers of reform and replacement filled the air. Some stopped to thank Daniel. Others apologized to me for believing the rumors. The neighborhood had been manipulated, but no longer. When we returned home, the night felt different, lighter, quieter. The cameras captured no suspicious visitors that evening. No staged barks echoed through the darkness. The street was still. The storm had not yet passed, but the winds were shifting, and Linda Caldwell was running out of shelter the days following. The explosive HOA meeting felt like the slow unwinding of a tightly coiled spring. The neighborhood, once dominated by whispers and suspicion, now simmered with a different kind of energy, one made of indignation, awakening, and curiosity. People stepped outside more often, spoke to each other in open clusters, and exchanged information freely. The narrative the HOA had carefully crafted was fracturing beyond repair, replaced by a collective desire to know what had really been happening behind closed doors. Daniel worked quietly during this time. Though his silence wasn't a sign of retreat, it was the calm efficiency of someone setting up the final stage of an unavoidable confrontation. He drafted formal requests for documentation from the board, records of complaints, meeting minutes, correspondence about the alleged incidents with Milo, and any written approvals for the warning letters. Each request was sent through certified channels, making it impossible for the board to ignore them without triggering legal consequences. And to no one's surprise, they struggled. Days passed without proper responses. What documents they did send were sparse, incomplete, or suspiciously edited. Entire sections of meeting minutes were missing. Emails referenced in official notices were nowhere to be found. The absence of records spoke louder than the presence of any forged proof ever could. Meanwhile, the neighborhood's stance continued to shift. Several residents approached me directly, offering apologies, support, or stories of their own unpleasant encounters with the board. One elderly couple quietly admitted they'd been fined twice for improper lawn coloration. After Linda decided their grass didn't appear green enough, a young mother confessed she had been threatened with a violation notice after letting her children draw chalk shapes on the sidewalk. These stories accumulated like layers of dust, revealing just how long the HOA had been abusing its authority. The pressure grew until the board could no longer pretend nothing was wrong. A special announcement appeared in everyone's mailbox: another emergency meeting. This one, however, was different. The wording carried a tone of desperation. The board intended to address false accusations and restore community faith, but the residents were no longer willing to accept vague reassurances. They wanted accountability. As the meeting day approached, the clubhouse parking lot again filled rapidly, though this time the atmosphere was charged with impatience rather than anxiety. People marched toward the building with purpose, hushed conversations giving way to louder, more confident voices. They were ready not for explanations, but for answers. Inside, the board members sat in their usual positions, though their composure had noticeably crumbled. Linda looked tired, her posture less rigid, her expression more defensive than commanding. The others avoided eye contact with the crowd entirely. The room settled. Waiting. Linda opened the meeting with a strained attempt at authority. She claimed there had been misinterpretations and procedural misunderstandings, but her words stumbled, unable to match the gravity of the choices she had made. She attempted to deflect blame onto administrative errors, clerical lapses, and even technological limitations. But the crowd had grown beyond accepting excuses. Daniel stepped forward, not as an outsider, but as a representative of the community now. Residents nodded toward him, signaling their trust. He began by presenting a clear, methodical summary of the evidence: the fabricated complaints, the staged recordings, the unauthorized notices, and the lack of required documentation. He unveiled timelines, referenced statutes, and presented direct contradictions between the HOA's claims and their own bylaws. He revealed the most damning discovery. A resident had confidentially provided him with screenshots of an internal board group chat where Linda and two others openly discussed getting rid of the dog, forcing compliance through fear, and setting an example to keep the neighborhood in line. The messages were unmistakable in their intent and devastating in their clarity. Gasps rippled through the room. Even those who had previously supported the board recoiled at the evidence. The chat logs left no room for interpretation. The board's actions had not been born of concern for safety or rule enforcement. They were the product of personal vendettas and a deliberate attempt to assert control through intimidation. Linda's composure shattered. She argued, flailed, accused Daniel of misrepresenting the logs. But the timestamps, usernames, and tone were unmistakably authentic. A board member seated to her left dropped his face into his hands. Another quietly slid her chair backward, as if distancing herself physically could erase her involvement. The residents didn't hesitate. Voices rose. Demands for resignation echoed across the room. Calls for removal votes, audits, and legal oversight shook the clubhouse walls. What once had been a quiet, compliant neighborhood had erupted into a collective force unwilling to be manipulated any longer. Daniel remained calm throughout the chaos. When the shouting eased into murmurs, he explained the formal process for board removal. Referencing specific clauses in the HOA's bylaws, he reminded everyone that they held the power, not the board. And with a majority vote, they could restructure the HOA leadership entirely. Someone moved to begin the vote. Nearly every hand rose when asked whether the board should be removed. Linda and the two members implicated in the messages were stripped of their positions immediately. Asterisk. The remaining members quietly submitted their resignations, unwilling to face what would come next. As the meeting ended, a spontaneous wave of applause filled the room, not for vengeance, but for justice. Daniel, unaccustomed to appreciation of this scale, simply nodded and stepped back. He had never sought acknowledgement. The dismantling of corruption was reward enough. In the days that followed, an interim committee was formed from long-standing firm-minded residents. They pledged transparency, fairness, and adherence to the actual bylaws. All concepts Linda and her allies had twisted for their own benefit. A formal apology letter was delivered to my home soon after. This time it was sincere, handwritten by several neighbors and signed by dozens more. They admitted their fear, their silence, and their regret. I accepted the apology not because they owed me personally, but because the neighborhood itself was healing. As for Milo, he remained blissfully unaware of his role in dismantling an entire corrupt system. He continued his peaceful routine, sleeping in sunlit patches on the floor, greeting neighbors with mild enthusiasm, and living his quiet, gentle life. People now stopped to pet him, offering treats and kind words. He became, unintentionally, a symbol of the neighborhood's turning point. Daniel eventually packed his briefcase and prepared to leave. He offered a final piece of advice: to stay vigilant, to read everything, and to never underestimate the power of a community united against injustice. As he drove away, the neighborhood felt brighter, lighter, and more open. The tyranny of the old HOA had crumbled. A new chapter had begun, and all because someone tried to ban a dog who never barked.